I've used this book before, but it's called Becoming Wise, an inquiry into the mystery and art of living. She took a lot of her interviews from her show and talked about the wisdom that she gained from talking to hundreds and hundreds of people over the years. She has a whole chapter on faith. And I'd like to share a little bit from that chapter, from one of the guests that she interviewed on her program. His name was Christian Women, or Wyman, W-I-M-A-N, but it sounds really funny to say Christian Women because that's how I would have pronounced it. Anyways, he's a poet and an essayist who has come to give voice to his own surprise, to the hunger for faith and the challenge for faith. As background, he was brought up in Texas, so he was soaked in both the history of violence and charismatic Christian culture. He wasn't formally religious for years after he left home, lived all over the world, and became a poet. Then when he was in his late 30s, he married the love of his life, found God again, and was diagnosed with an incurable, unpredictable cancer. As far as I know, he is still alive and teaching faith and literature at Yale's Institute for Sacred Music. He says this about faith. I think of belief as having objects. Faith doesn't have objects. Faith is an orientation of your life, or it's an energy of your life, or however you want to define it, but I think it's objectless. There's some combination of austerity and clarity that I think we as a whole culture are grasping toward. And the main movement of the culture is against it. All the political language, all that is just rot. But I do think there's this huge cultural grasping towards something that won't be so frou-frou and slip out of our grasp and just make us think it's ridiculous. And yet also something that is open enough to engage those parts of us that we don't understand. Doubt is so woven in with what I think of as faith that it can't be separated. I'm convinced that the same God that might call me to sing of God at one time might call me at another to sing of God less, yes. Sometimes when I think of all this energy that's going on, these different people trying to find some way of naming and sharing their belief, I think it may be the case that God calls some people to unbelief in order that faith can take new forms.
Today's reading is from Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Jesus told the disciples a parable on the necessity of praying always and not losing heart. Once there was a judge in a certain city who feared no one, not even God. A woman in that city who had been widowed kept coming to the judge and saying, "Give me legal protection from my opponent." For a time the judge refused, but finally the judge thought, "I care little for God or any people, but this woman won't leave me alone. I better give her the protection she seeks, or she'll keep coming and wear me out." Jesus said, "Listen to what this corrupt judge is saying. Won't God then do justice to the chosen who call out day and night? Will God delay long over them? I tell you, God will give them swift justice. But when the promised one comes, will faith be found anywhere on earth?"
Would you pray with me? Divine Essence, as we seek deeper understanding and as we look for guidance and strength to get through our days, may you dwell with us intimately in this time, that we might feel and know that the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts might be filled with your wisdom and your insight. Amen. So our conversation this morning is about faith, which is a really difficult conversation to have because it's a difficult thing to define. It's like trying to define love. He's trying to define faith. So let's start with our non-biblical reading, which her guest, Christian, talks about faith not having objects. Although usually when we talk about faith, we give it an object, don't we? We say, well, I have faith in Sally, and I have faith in Sacred Journeys, or I have faith that the sun will rise again tomorrow. Our faith always seems to have an object, and yet he's suggesting that it's really objectless, that the essence of faith is an energy. It's a movement outward from ourselves. It's the way we live in life. Do you agree? Is my question of the day. Does that make sense? Because I'm going to ask the harder question now. Because I think I agree. When I spent some time thinking about that, the very core of faith has to be lived. It has to be an action. It can't simply be a word. It has to be a way that we are in this life. And if that's true, how do we define faith? If we take the objects away, how do you define faith? How is it lived? How is it felt? Yeah?
I would think it might, since we can't really know,
Mm-hmm.
it might be just being open to infinite possibilities.
Okay, so being open to infinite possibilities. Ron?
I think of it as a fundamental trust in something you can't fully comprehend.
Okay. A fundamental trust in something you can't fully comprehend or know. What else, Rox?
A source of inner peace.
A source of inner peace. So it begins inside. What else? Faith. How does it feel? How does it express itself?
Trust.
In trust in anything in particular?
Knowing something will be.
Knowing something will be. Okay. I like the trust and confidence piece. That's part of what I felt. Not that, and all of those are wonderful. I think part of it is in being acted out. It's acted out in believing, yes, that there are endless possibilities, that there is a way, that things will get better, that there is goodness, a trust that there is goodness in the world for me, a trust in that peace that I know dwells somewhere within me that some days I just can't feel at all. A trust in our connectedness, our oneness, a trust in the aliveness of the Spirit everywhere. I think it's a very broad definition once we really start to think about the essence of faith. So let me take you to the scripture reading for a second. The first and last lines. In the first line it says, Jesus is talking to the disciples. And he's explaining the necessity to pray always and to not lose heart. To pray always and to not lose heart. And then he gives this nice little parable about the widow, which is probably a sermon in and of itself, but we're just not going to go there. But she's the one who exemplifies not giving up, not losing heart. And then at the very last line he says, but when the promised one comes, will faith be found anywhere on earth? I find that an interesting wrap-up to all of that. And I wonder if he doesn't equate faith with the ability to not lose heart. But will will there still be people around who don't lose heart in the face of overwhelming odds? Because the widow that he talks about in that parable lived her life against all odds. She was, part of the lowest of the low. She had no rights, she had no property, she had no respect in that day and age, and yet she kept heart that things would get better. Faith. It's sort of interesting that he doesn't say, someday, will there be Jews anywhere on earth? Clearly doesn't say, are there going to be Christians found anywhere on earth? Because there was no such thing, right? He says, will faith be found anywhere on earth? Will people still be hanging in there and believing in goodness and light and possibilities? Will there be trust and confidence? And the knowing of that peace inside, will that still exist? He takes it way outside of the bounds of religion as far as I'm concerned. Faith is not about religion. It's about so much more. That's not to say you can't be religious if you have faith. That's not to say that part of your expression of faith might not be to go to worship, but we can't limit faith to those who set foot in a church. Because certainly I've known a whole lot of people who go to church and who say they believe certain things, and we do not see it in their actions. And I believe faith has got to be an action. Our guest Christian in Krista Tippett's book said that we know that our spiritual inclinations are valid if they move outward from us. If you're going to talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. That's how we know that they're valid, that they're real. So, we do a lot of equating faith with church. And faithful people with only those people who go to church. But if we limit it to that, then I would have to answer Jesus' question by saying, I don't think the future looks so good for whether there are going to be faithful people found on the earth. Because at least in the U.S. and in Western Europe, those who attend services, those who claim to be religious, continue to decline. Not so much other places in the world, but certainly in those places. And the largest, if you read the surveys, and probably many of you have, the largest growing religious segment, quote unquote, are the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S. Yeah, not the nuns with the habit. The N-O-N-E-S. Those who have no religious affiliation, and oh, by the way, they don't want one. But to say that all of those people have no faith would be a misnomer on our part, I believe. Sure, we have younger generations who are very suspicious of organized religion and its doctrine and its tenets. And perhaps it just doesn't make sense to them anymore. Or maybe they weren't brought up in the church and so they're not going. But studies also show that that generation still wants a spiritual connection, but they find it differently. They find it in reaching out to help others. They find it in caring for the church, or for caring for the world, for the earth, for creation. They find it in action. That's their faith. So perhaps it's time to put a larger definition onto what faithful looks like. and work on our own faith. One of the other interviews that Krista did in her book was with a guy named Shane Claiborne, who is an activist and an author and a leader in the new monasticism movement, also one of the founders of a nonprofit organization called The Simple Life. And he talks about how faith is being expressed in many, many different ways that have nothing to do with religion. He said he came across a family who believed strongly in the commandment that you should love your neighbor as yourself. And so they tried to live that in one very, probably in a lot of ways, but in one very specific way, which was for every biological child they sent to college, they started a scholarship fund for an at-risk child to go to college. And then they got to know that child and that child's family, and they helped them make that happen because God knows that system is hard to manage and maneuver by yourself. He talked about a group of teenage girls that he described as sort of your preppy cheerleader type. But they heard Mother Teresa say, there are Calcuttas everywhere if only we open our eyes. And they took that to heart. And they looked around their neighborhood. And they found a nursing home. And they went to that nursing home and they asked for all of the women who weren't being visited, who didn't have family caring for them. And they started to visit them, and they painted their fingernails, and they painted their toes, and they listened to their stories. He talked about another family, a husband and wife, who couldn't have a child. And they happened to be walking around their neighborhood one day, and they came across a woman who had recently found herself homeless, who was 6 months pregnant. And they took her home. And they said, we'll figure this out as we go. And they got along so well with this woman that they let her stay there until she had the baby. And then things continued to go so well that the mother and the baby continued to live there, and they all raised the child together. Shane, the one who told this story, visited that family again 10 years later, right before that story was told, and he said when he went back, he found that the woman that was homeless was now a nurse. They were still living there. And the woman who couldn't have a child now had MS and was dying. But you know what? She had a nurse living in her house who was helping to care for her. And you can't tell me that those actions are not actions filled with faith, because they are. That's faith expressed in goodness, in the belief in possibilities, in a groundedness in something more and a deeper spiritual connection with all of life. When Jesus talked about faith, that's what he talked about. It was a heart thing and an action thing. It wasn't a pompous spouting of beliefs and laws and prayers. It was giving your coat to someone else. It was taking a child up on your knees. It was helping the widow. It was welcoming the stranger and the foreigner. It was praying privately. Faith, I really believe, is an action that we can all cultivate. Because I think sometimes we have that faith, and sometimes our faith is lacking, and we close up, and we don't act out of those possibilities and those hopes and the belief in the goodness of all people. Jenny, you may remember this, but there were a number of years ago in ASP, we had a house where, they're built into the sides of these, okay, so down in Appalachia, the houses are built into the sides of the hills, right? And so when it rains, the water just goes straight under the house and it rots out. the foundations and the floors and the walls. And so on this particular house we were working on, the crew before us dug a trench behind the house to catch the water before it went under the house and drain it around the other side and down the hill. Well, before we got there early that week, the gravel they had put in that drainage ditch had completely washed out when it had rained so hard. So one of the things that was our job to do was to fill that ditch with bigger stones. And we waited all week for those stones to get there so that we could fill that and finish that for that family. It was Friday afternoon. It hadn't gotten there. We were waiting for the truck to deliver. We thought, we'll go. It's our last day. We were tired of peanut butter and jelly. Okay, just saying. So we went to the pizza joint down the road. Don't tell anyone. And when we got back, there was a 4-ton pile of stones in the driveway with my gloves underneath, by the way. Bad place for them. But we were determined that we were going to get that pile of stones in that ditch before we left. This is like 2 o'clock. So before we left in 2.5, 3 hours. And you have to remember that the driveway was under the house, so all the stones had to go up the hill and behind the house and off to the side. And we worked really hard, didn't we, Jim? We had like 2 of us on every wheelbarrow just to get it up the hill. And long story short, we managed. We got those 4 tons. And if you've ever shoveled rocks, that was not a fun afternoon. But we did it. We left the family a rock with a phrase on it. And it said, "Keep the faith." And we all signed our names. It wasn't about keep going to church. It wasn't about trust in Jesus. It was keep the faith. The faith in the goodness of humanity. The faith that people care. The faith that there are ways and possibilities. The faith that the Spirit moves and that you're loved and that grace happens. So, despite my sometimes cynical, jaded attitude, despite the fact that we appear to have a deplorable lack of decency in our country these days, I would have to answer Jesus' question with yes. I think if we expand the definition of faith, that faith is alive and well. And it's our part to keep it alive and well. Because the more we show goodness and trust in something better and in something more, the more we give that to the world, the more faith increases. When my faith and my life sort of, when I struggled sitting in the hospital room with my father a couple weeks ago, and you can't find that faith for a little while. It's the people who are around, they carry it for you, they give it back to you. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's for us to carry it and give it back to everybody else that keeps it alive and well. Amen.